So the next of our duo of delights is Craig Packer. People often say somebody needs no introduction. In this case, it surely must be true that if you have the tiniest interest in carnivores, in African conservation, or in lions, you must surely have heard of Craig Packer. He's one of the giants of his generation in terms of conservation biology. And Craig, the floor is yours for half an hour.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to do a number of things within this overall framework of how we think about parks can and should be supported. And what I want to do, though, is to first think globally. And I want to remind you of the scale of what people consider to be desirable and what is actually real in terms of the amount of protection that we're trying to give to the planet. Now, a couple of years ago, E.O. Wilson published this book called Half Earth, suggesting that we really should dedicate half of the Earth's surface to the natural world. Now, this is in excess of what the Convention for Biological Diversity in the early 90s at Aichi set at 17%. And a lot of people will talk about, is 17% enough? Is 50% enough? And what I want to try to do is a reality check and just say that, well, actually, what we're doing right now, and in terms of strictly protected areas, it's less than 15%. It's 14.7% of terrestrial land is set aside as protected. And of that 14.7%, 30% of it is under very intense human pressure. So what I want to do here is to emphasize that what we're really talking about is inadequate funding, inadequate support for a large part of this inadequate proportion of the Earth's surface. Okay, oops. So I want to ask how much of this is actually being adequately funded. And so I want to start by just giving a bit of history, talking specifically about Africa. And really, we often have our initial impressions are based on the places we've heard of or we've dreamt of. And I think a lot of places, like the Serengeti, Kruger, etc., have loomed large in our imagination. And we think of these as very special, fully protected places. But I just want to put this in perspective that the notion of these areas is about 120 years old. The oldest protected area in Africa was designated as the Sabi Game Reserve in South Africa. That's the forerunner of what's today Kruger National Park. And the idea of setting aside land for wildlife in those days was kind of an idealized notion that somehow, oh yeah, that's a great area over there, we should set it aside, we won't have any agriculture for it. But how are we going to sustain it? How are we going to maintain it? And so initially, the Sabi Game Reserve, for several years, had 2 policemen to patrol an area the size of Lebanon. So the point of this is that that was not realistic. It was not adequate, okay? But this is how it got started. Up in East Africa, a few years later, during the Germans' occupation of Tanganyika, now Tanzania, they had designated about 30,000 square kilometers in 15 separate protected areas. And the idea of protecting these areas was to involve local people for sure, but in just a very few hands. So it was left in the hands of a local chief assisted by 1 or 2 local game scouts. So the idea here is that we've got an area now that's the size of Belgium, administered by no more than 30 to 50 people. So this is not a substantial investment in this land. This is not really being realistic about what it would take to look after these areas and protect them. Because after all, these it was to protect it from overhunting, overconsumption, overutilization of whatever form. Now, in the history of Africa, there were a series of conservation agreements that were largely meant to define areas within the colonial landscape. So there's the London Convention in the year 1900 with principles for protection of wildlife set aside by Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. There's the London Convention in 1933. In 1968, there was the Algiers Convention, now with a lot of the newly independent countries setting these aside. And when they did this, in the documents, legal documents of the time, they were specifying that the contracting states had these obligations to protect areas with conservation status, and to protect the ecosystems, conserve the species, and they also specified that the land should be maintained in a way that's ecologically rational, economically sound, socially acceptable, that should protect and improve the environment while benefiting the local environment, the local population, the local people. So the idea of sustainable use was really there in the 1960s, that this is something that will benefit ultimately the people of Africa as well as maintain the wildlife. But there was no clear mechanism for how to pay for it. How is this going to be achieved? So what we see is that in the following, or over that period of time, it was recognized that there were a number of very wealthy Europeans and Americans who'd like to come to Africa and shoot things, and there are also a lot of people who like to come over and just watch wildlife. So visitors' fees, entrance fees, hunting fees could be charged, and so wildlife could conceivably pay its way. Those early reserves, well, wait, yeah, we can pay for this. We can pay the salaries of our rangers and everything if we charge user fees. But as the human population in Africa began to grow, and as the demands of local populations came to the forefront, this really became imperative. It's not an option, but wildlife would have to pay its way. Otherwise, the land should be used for something else, for agriculture or for pasture. So we see this notion, this divided use between wildlife tourism and hunting, in particular in a country like Tanzania, which today has about 40,000 square kilometers of national parks, a larger number of areas, a larger amount of land set aside as game reserves and game control areas where trophy hunting can take place. And although we think of a few key places that could attract a lot of tourism, like the Serengeti and Ngorongoro, etc., in Tanzania, there's a lot of it is what Hemingway referred to as 1,000,000 miles of bloody Africa, that you would never be able to get enough photo tourists to come in to bring their families. It's tsetse fly infested, it's malarial swamps, whatever. This is only going to be for the hardiest individuals who come over and shoot things and pay for the privilege. So our source of revenue then is phototourism and sport hunting. Now, a number of us have been looking at how much money it needs to be raised to actually look after the protected area network that exists in Africa. What is the amount that is effective to actually protect the wildlife in here? And the most recent and most comprehensive survey on this of all was recently published by Peter Lindsay. And the colors here indicate the severity of the funding shortfall. So if you are in gray, South Africa and Kenya are, according to this, raising a reasonable amount of money through tourism and looking after their wildlife estate. In the yellow, they are not meeting a very large proportion of it. And if you're in the red, 90% shortfall. So barely 10% of the funding needs are being met, a huge shortfall in what's needed. And the scale of this is really quite large because so many countries in Africa have big percentages of their real estate in parks and reserves, like Tanzania. They've exceeded the 17% recommended by CBD, and now they're stuck with this very expensive land with a huge shortfall. So where's the money? So of the phototourism places, we see that there's still a notion that you go, you pay your park fees, and that's supposed to cover for the National Park Service, for all the rangers, for all the anti-poaching, for whatever community projects they might be engaged with in the neighboring communities. That's where the money comes from. Well, it turns out, as is clear from that last chart, very few places are achieving that. And in fact, there's only about 5 or 6 parks across all of Africa that are raising enough revenue to be able to cover those necessary costs. And so what I want to do here now is to contrast that model with what we're used to in our own countries. So in the US, Yellowstone has a budget of about $4,500 per square kilometer per year. That's only about twice of what we're thinking is necessary in Africa, 2 to 4 times as much. We heard last night about the Lake District, so I'll show you a different park here in Britain, the Peak District, and its annual budget's about £4,500 per square kilometer per year. Now that funding to support these parks, that's what's being paid out, and it's not by user fees, okay? Those are being covered by tax dollars whether we go or not, okay? There's a totally different model for funding these protected areas in the Western industrialized nations compared to Africa, okay? We've got the GDP, we've got the incomes so that we can do it through our tax base. But if we look at Africa, we've got the poorest continent on earth, so they lack the tax base to cover those management costs. They have wildlife that inflicts the heaviest costs on humans. You've got man-eating lions, you've got elephants. It's crazy, okay? And yet, wildlife is supposed to pay its way. So, ecotourism has been it was meant to be the engine paying for all of this in the first place, but there's many, many problems with it. First, just with phototourism, as I've already said, only a few parks raise a lot of revenue. So in Tanzania, there's Serengeti National Park, attracts a lot of tourists, and Kilimanjaro, a lot of people go to climb the mountain. And those are the two that generate by far the lion's share of income for the entire nation's National Park Service. But these parks are already overcrowded, okay? If we're going to use money from Serengeti and Kilimanjaro to cover the costs of Ruaha and Katavi and Sudani and places that are further away from the tourist routes, we can't insist on having yet more people come to the Serengeti because it's already a bit of a circus. And also, if you're doing the economics of it, you're asking for the potential clients, are you going to spend your discretionary funds for holidays either to go to the Serengeti or you're going to go to Disney World? So you can't charge 10 times as much in the Serengeti to make up for the shortfall because then everybody will just go to Disney World. Well, some people will. Okay, and sport hunting has its own problems. The amount of money that's generated by sport hunting is far less than people think. A lot less of that money actually makes it to local communities than is usually claimed. And I like to use the example made famous here by your local lion guys here. And also I'm from Minnesota, and my local dentist, Walter Palmer, who famously went to Zimbabwe and was very rude to Cecil. Okay? Now, in most parts of the world, when you hear about what somebody like Walter Palmer will spend on shooting a lion, it seems disgusting. He's spending $50,000. What an ostentatious display of conspicuous consumption. Well, in fact, you know, if you actually work out roughly what he should have paid, if you had a hunting concession and all they did was raise lions, and they have all the necessary prey with all the necessary landscape, and the lion has to grow long enough to be able to reach the age he can be harvested, you really ought to charge that dentist $1 million, and you ought to make sure that all $1 million went back to support Wangi National Park and the Zimbabwean conservation system. Okay, but that's not what happened with the $50,000 even then. And when it comes to hunting, again, there's alternatives. Just like you could go to Disney World instead of go to the Serengeti with your kids. If you really want to shoot a lion and you don't want to spend $1 million, what you can do is there's plenty of lion farmers in South Africa who are keen to raise lions on their property. They feed them, they go to the local abattoir and get leftover horse meat and cattle. And so they can be profitable by allowing you to come over and shoot one of their lions in a very small area for only $20,000. So the kind of money that needs to be generated by lion hunting is very hard to raise. And it's spawned an alternative industry in South Africa, which is the canned hunting industry. So, if we revisit what's been going on the last few decades, remember I showed you that there's a lot more hunting areas in Tanzania than there were national parks. That's old news. In the last dozen years or so, over half of Tanzania's hunting estate has been abandoned. And so there's less hunting than there was before because of the economics. Because people were not reinvesting and looking after the management and the conservation of the resources on the areas that they're releasing from the Tanzanian government, the wildlife's gone. So they couldn't turn a profit on what was left. Okay? So what do we do about this? We know that it's much more expensive than everybody has been thinking. It requires a huge investment to be able to pay for the maintenance of these big parks, these large areas of wildlife. And it seems pretty clear by now that wildlife cannot purely pay its own way. So what we need to be thinking about is, are there ways to help subsidize these costs in some way? And UNESCO famously has dedicated itself to identifying a number of key areas around the world that reflect an importance to human civilization, World Heritage Sites. And there's a number of World Heritage Sites in Africa, and many of those World Heritage Sites are wildlife reserves. Okay? But the shocking thing is that even though UNESCO goes to all this effort, and these places are so famous and so critically important, the amount of funding that UNESCO provides to maintain those places is absolutely nothing. It's just a branding exercise. If you have a World Heritage Site in your country, good on you. You can put that in your tourist brochures, but you get no help from UNESCO in looking after it. Well, this is a shame because wildlife, these World Heritage Sites, could be really important to the development, the economic development, alleviation of poverty in these areas. And so a number of people have been thinking about how can you engage organizations like the World Bank to recognize the direct value of wildlife for development. And it's clear that wildlife, and a number of people have talked about this, that wildlife is a really important part of the economies in a number of third world countries. I mean, amazingly, countries like Rwanda and Tanzania, that's over 20% of their foreign exchange comes from tourism. That's huge. Yet, we see in Tanzania, I'm still picking on Tanzania, they threw me out. I can't go back, so I can say whatever I want about Tanzania. So it's fine. I can say this with impunity. So a lot of you know that Tanzania is trying its best now to disassemble the Selous Game Reserve, which is one of the largest, oldest, most extraordinary wildlife areas in all of Africa, by building a huge dam that nobody really needs. And Tanzania, before this, a few years ago, decided, what's this with these World Heritage Sites? You're telling us that we have this amazing place, but you won't help us pay for looking after it, and we can't farm it. We can't do anything with it because it's now a freaking World Heritage Site. So it turns out, whereas they decided, they went back on an application they made and said, forget it, we're not going to do that. Just recently, looking at these World Heritage Sites, DRC has 5 of its sites that are threatened. And so, by the agreement with UNESCO, they're really supposed to do something. UNESCO waves its angry finger and says, you guys aren't looking after your World Heritage Site. DRC wrote back and said, well, maybe we shouldn't have them because you're not helping us pay for it. So, you folks met Edmund McCullough the other day, and he told us that, in fact, he didn't actually make it this clear, but he told me that because of what DRC is doing, he's using that as an opportunity. Gives him the chance to now go to the World Bank, back to the UN, and say, hey, you know what? We need to start contributing. We need to start helping to pay for these places because the African nations can't pay it for themselves. So he's put in the proposal. Hopefully he'll get a response in the next few months. So maybe there will be funding that will start coming in, the kind of subsidy that's necessary to make up these shortfalls. Okay, so meanwhile, we have only a limited amount of funding. Even if Edmund is very successful, it's going to be a process that's going to take years to unfold. So for the foreseeable future, there's only enough outside funding to support a few protected areas. Okay? You can't evenly spread all your money to everything, or just everything's going to be inadequate. So you have to decide, really, what are we going to do? Now, you could embark on some sort of policy of triage. And you say, well, oh God, we have to have these. Just in the same way that there are World Heritage Sites, those really have to survive. Okay? But if we're thinking about what's happening in terms of bringing subsidies to some of these countries, we have to bring in mind what I'll go ahead and say is the C word of conservation, corruption. Okay? We know corruption is horrific in a lot of these countries. Even health systems, even just making sure that there's going to be adequate protection for their populations against malaria, HIV, et cetera, the World Bank estimates that it loses between 40 and 80% of its funding in some of these countries through leakage or corruption. Okay? If we look at the distribution of corruption across the world, boom, Africa is one of the worst places. So, large-scale corruption is a problem. This is poor governance, nothing gets done in the first place, there's no accountability, and in areas that do generate a lot of revenue from wildlife, this may be diverted to a few individuals within the government, or the government may actually divert the funding, say, from the national parks for its re-election the next year. Okay? So there are some well-documented cases of grand-scale corruption involving revenues going to places like Masai Mara, Ngorongoro Crater, etc. Okay, so they have very little incentive to change. The status quo is great. If somebody's going to give them some money, yay, they'll be thrilled. But it may not make a difference. So we've heard from various people around here about African Parks. This is a philanthropic organization based in South Africa and the US that has been successful at obtaining long-term government contracts with some amazing countries that you wouldn't think of as wildlife destinations, like Chad, the Central African Republic, etc. Okay? Now, what they've been able to do is to convince governments in many of these countries that do not have a pre-existing wildlife tourism industry that you got nothing to lose by outsourcing the management of your park to us. Okay? So they negotiate pretty tough, and they gain total management authority, and they've successfully reintroduced some species that have been extirpated. They've restored ecosystem processes. They've done this in 15 sites across a bunch of countries so far, and they're aiming to do another 5 by the end of next year. And this is all philanthropic, okay? So they have a $50 million per annual budget from philanthropic sources. Now, they are fostering tourism in these areas, but if the tourism doesn't cover the full cost, that's okay, because it's primarily philanthropic. It's not a business. It's a philanthropic exercise. Okay, so we would ask then, is the best policy to go for the few key places that we think are really important? Well, maybe not. I mean, this is just a kind of graphical representation of what African Parks has come up with, and a few others, that if you're going to lose a lot of money to corruption, there may be a park like the one on the far left there that has enormous biodiversity value, and it just needs a little bit of a top-up that would bring it, make sure it's absolutely the best Serengeti it could possibly be. But if half the money's stolen, you're not getting a very good return on your investment. If you go down the chart to places that may not have the best biodiversity value, but the government's not involved with it, all the money you go in comes back in terms of biodiversity improvement. So the point of that is that you might actually want to focus on rescuing reserves that hold no financial incentive to corrupt African governments. Okay? So that was the C word in conservation. Now I want to go to the F word in conservation, which is the fence. Okay? This was a project I did in collaboration with a lot of people here from WildCRU, particularly Andy Leverage and Sue Canny. And we were able to estimate how well lion populations are being conserved. And the thing that just popped out from the data, and it's no surprise, this is not rocket science, but if you have a park that's completely enclosed by a fence, the lions don't eat anybody. They don't eat near cows, so the lions do fine. But if you don't fence it, then you got a real problem. And so some of those estimates early on were talking about how much money it takes to protect a park. It's partly because we see examples of places over there on the far left of an unfenced reserve where the annual budget is tiny, $10 per square kilometer. That's great. What an investment, okay? It actually turns out, you need a lot of money in order to get it up there. But if you fence it, for a given area, if you can fence it, and I'll get to this in a second, don't panic yet, you get a better return on investment because all of those black dots are really pretty good regardless of how much the expenditure, once it's been fenced. And the thing is that there's a lot of examples in southern Africa where having a fence is what has allowed for restoration ecology, what that has allowed rewilding to take place. Okay? There are now more lions in South Africa than there were 100 years ago. And the reason for this is that back in the day, lions were left only out in a few marginal areas, transboundary areas with Mozambique or Botswana or somewhere, and everywhere else they were gone. But there's been a restoration movement in South Africa, and the first thing you do is you say, hey, we put a fence in. We got this area, it's 1,000 square kilometers or whatever it is, and local people okay if us bringing back lions, bringing back elephants, because they're not going to hurt you, okay? They guarantee the safety of the local community, very first thing, and then the local community sign on and say, sure, that's great, okay? So fencing has been successful in South Africa, and it may be what much of Africa is going to look like 100 years from now, because anybody who's been down there, it looks more like Arizona or New Mexico than it looks like the rest of Africa, because there's just industry everywhere, there's economic activity everywhere, there's private ownership of land everywhere. And there are a lot of very successful fenced populations. Okay, but you can't do this everywhere. And so I want to go back up to East Africa. This is the Serengeti, and this one place kind of can help us think about why and where you might use that tactic. In areas of high rainfall, like between Serengeti National Park and Lake Victoria, all the land out there has been converted to agriculture. So yellow is stable agriculture. Red is land that's been converted to agriculture in the last 10 or 15 years. And anything that still looks green there, that map's old, it's probably gone and is agricultural now, okay? To the right, it's not like that because it's too dry. I'll get there. So the left is high rainfall, and you have farms right up to the park boundary, and you have people growing maize, you have people growing food crops, and the only reason that animals are going to go out there anymore is to feed people's crops. And so there's a huge amount of concern in Western Serengeti because the elephants, the jumbos as they call them, come over and destroy people's livelihoods. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the park, it's too dry for crops. And the livelihood over there is pastoralism. Over there, the rainfall is so ephemeral, unpredictable, everything has to move around on big distances. You should not fence it because you'd be blocking wildlife, you'd be taking away the resources from the cattle people, so everything has to stay open. And so we're working on a project, this is with Enrico Dominin and Rob Slato, trying to say, well, where could you put a fence? Where is it rainy enough so that it's just crops? Where are there so many people? You have to have a fence between Nairobi National Park and Nairobi downtown. Yes, you do. Okay? So you have to do that. So the pink on there is where the human population density is already so high. It's kind of crazy to think that you'd want to have any kind of interactions between lions and elephants. Okay? But there are a lot of areas that are too dry for that. That's most obvious down in southern Africa, Namibia, Botswana. And there are places in East Africa as well. So you don't fence everywhere. Okay? But the thing about these unfenced areas, I come back to the half-Earth notion. So we're below the Aichi target of 17%. It's been at 14.7%. If we're really thinking about where there could be more land, it's possible. It could still happen. So now I want to switch gears, and I want to talk about how the real estate, the global wildlife estate can still grow, thanks to a lot of the things that people have been talking about in terms of the commons, in terms of community conservancies. And so, like in Masai Mara, which is the north end of the Serengeti, that's largely pastoralist area. You shouldn't fence that area at all. But you have to have really close connections with the local communities there. And so the reserve itself in the Mara is a classic case of a mismanaged government reserve. There's a lot of corruption. A lot of the revenue doesn't make it into conservation. The livestock grazing is out of control in many parts of the reserve. Wildlife numbers have been declining. But meanwhile, there are these private reserves, these private conservancies that have sprung up in the last 10 or 15 years, and they're community-owned. Large numbers of families, and that one in the middle, the Aurori Motorogi Conservancy, it's private land, okay? People can make the decision to be part of this. It was this long negotiation. So all the things that we've heard people talk about, values, attitudes, participation, all that was done over a very long period of time before the thing was initiated. And I visited that several times, and also some up in the north, and they're fabulous. They really are quite successful in bringing back wildlife numbers that were not present not that long ago. Now I'm going to go somewhere really crazy. So, elephants. They're in the desert, okay? This is near Timbuktu. There's still elephants there, okay? And amazingly, Sukani here has been doing this amazing work, and some of you may have heard her talk yesterday. She's helping to keep track and to protect an area of about 40,000 square kilometers. That's a big chunk of land, not a protected area, not a formal protected area at all, okay? And there's a few hundred elephants there that use this area, okay? And so she's gone in with her team, and they've worked with the traditional community governance structure, okay? And they've found ways that people can maintain value from the land by looking after it properly, okay? There's plenty of pastoralists around who might overgraze, but with proper grazing practices, they can actually gain revenue by renting it for the right people for pastures, preventing fires in certain areas, et cetera, et cetera. They've worked with women's associations so that they then add a synergy of value to the traditional activities that are already there with new perspectives on the way to use the natural resources that are now being nurtured within this area, okay? And this is despite, these are jihadists. I mean, this is after Gaddafi, and you've got all, civil war in Mali and everything. So there's no tourism anymore, and yet they've been able to set up a team of eco-guards who go out and patrol the area, they protect the elephants, and they're trying to deal with mitigating the pressures coming in from these jihadists and everything. And so there's this wonderful chart of how, with their eco-guardians, there are various activities in there, work from the bottom up, literally I love it's a great graph, the bottom up. And it goes upwards, and you get to the goal there of elephant protection. This is what's driven the project in the first place, okay? And what's paying for it? Because this is what I'm concerned about. How do you pay for this? How does this happen? It doesn't happen out of thin air. Well, so they pay the eco-guardians what they call recognition payments. Where does that money come from? Well, initially that was donor-driven, okay? But in some of the villages where there's been full participation on that, they've been so successful in enhancing the livelihoods and ecosystem resilience from their conservancy activities, that pays for it. There you go. Don't need the World Bank on that one. Well, I bet you would like the World Bank on that, but it's not absolutely essential, right? Okay? And at the same time, this is also attracting men to do something positive for conservation rather than going off and, raising hell as jihadists somewhere. Now, how could this happen? Well, what they found out was, and this is what's made this possible, is that in interviewing people, the people really like the elephants. The vast majority of people in that community, they liked elephants. They really liked the elephants, and they didn't want them to go away. Okay? These Tuareg guys with guns were having fun shooting elephants, but no, you don't do that. Those are our elephants. They're really important to us. Because if we lose our elephants, then our environment will hurt. Okay? So, where does this come from? Okay? And again, we've been hearing from people that people's values and attitudes really matter. And so these are Dogon people, and they have strong animist faith. So there's a reverence for life. So where that existed, all this became possible, okay? Last example I want to give you, I want to now leave Africa just briefly, go to Asia, and talk about the Asiatic lion. Now, the Asiatic lion was down to just a handful of animals by the beginning of the 20th century, okay? But it's been growing, okay? And so this is from the 1960s up until 2015, and there's now, it's one population, but it can be divided between those that are inside the Gir Reserve, the Gir Forest Reserve. But look what's happened outside. There were no lions at all through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now they're growing like crazy outside the reserve. This is expanding your 14.7% because now you got lions in a much bigger area than you had before. Looking on a map, this is the Gir Reserve in green here, but there are lions all the way out here, moving all over the place. How did that happen? This is India, okay? Now, the lions are livestock predators here. They're serious predators of livestock, okay? But the Gujarati government pays for a lot of wildlife trackers and sort of village scouts who are employed to help identify cows that have been eaten by lions, and if it merits some sort of compensation, they pay them like the same day. Okay, and they're on it because there's 700 people. There's 700 people. There's like 100 lions out there, and there's 700 people out there helping look after them. Okay? So how can this happen? What's going on? Well, so we have Donald Trump. You have Brexit. India has its Prime Minister Modi, who is also a populist, okay, and he's also a fundamentalist, okay? So part of his political appeal has been towards traditional Hindu values, which are vegetarian, non-beefitarian. They drink a lot of milk and dairy products in India, but they don't eat beef, traditionally, okay? So there are all these cows, okay? And basically, he's forbidden anybody from doing anything with the sacred cows. So there's tons of cows outside Gir Forest that nobody wants. And they can't do anything about it because they're going to be in trouble with the Hindu fundamentalists. But when the lions come to eat it, yes. Okay? How's that for a deal? Okay? Okay, so values, attitudes. What could work better for the lions, right? Okay, so to summarize. It's pretty clear that the model for funding Africans Park has not been working. These reserves cannot pay their way. Ecotourism is essential. It's really important, but it's insufficient. Meaningful conservation of these state-run protected areas will require international subsidies. Hopefully Edmund's going to be successful in convincing his buddies at the UN and get the World Bank engaged, and there will be funding that will come in for at least some of them. Meanwhile, it's really important, and this is also true if they get the success on that. He talked to me about there being verification to ensure that the funding is actually spent properly. Meanwhile, as we've seen with African parks, it's very important to set up the right kind of public-private partnerships so that when millions of dollars are coming in, it doesn't get stolen. And eventually, whatever African parks is doing, it can't be donor-driven forever. It's going to have some sort of institutional subsidies that are coming in from multinational organizations that ensure this goes on not just for a few decades, because it sounds like a great idea, but it goes on for centuries so that future generations can see these animals. And the other thing I want to say is that, okay, we're only at 14.7%. A lot of what people have been talking about at this conference is really outside of that estate, looking at the kinds of conflict issues that could be mitigated. And I've tried to give you just a few examples with Masai Mara, Mali, and India, where it seems to be happening. Okay? All of these require meaningful engagement with the local communities, as you all well know. In the Mara, it's very clear that they had the land rights to be able to do this. There's a profit motive because those are high tourist areas around Masai Mara. And also, clearly, as with the Dogon animists and the Hindu nationalists, it helps to have a cultural bias that's in favor of the wildlife. Thank you.
Marvellous. Well, what a feast. Rodrigo, please come back up here. Now is the opportunity. Right up there, you dive into the screen. Okay, you two can fight for the microphone or perhaps share this one. Is there another microphone running around in the back of the room? Tim has that. Questions for either or both of our speakers, who in turn may choose to make questions to each other about what they've heard or comments. So we've got 20 minutes before tea. Yes. I'll give you this one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I want to ask you a question. You were talking about game reserves in Africa cannot pay for their own maintenance. But I want to find out from you, don't you think if at all Africa had proper management systems, don't you think it's possible that these game reserves could be able really to pay for themselves? Looking at the number of international tourists that visit the game reserves, the number of accommodation facilities which are found within those game reserves, if at all money was not going to the government treasury, and there is some form of system that is introduced where the money is really for that particular game reserve, don't you think they would actually have more than enough money to maintain themselves?
I'll use this one. Yeah, absolutely. Efficiencies are always good. And I think that, we're not there yet, but that would make a great topic for the next Geopolitics workshop, where people could actually talk about how you would try to improve efficiencies of some of these management systems. And I don't think it's easy to do that given the lack of input from outside sources so far. I mean, I think it should certainly be encouraged as much as possible. But I think until, let's dream. I mean, we might as well dream. It's our last day here. We're tired. We've heard a lot of depressing stories, but let's just have a few rays of hope here. Let's say that Edmund's successful and he can help bring some money in like that. He could then provide a lot of strings and say, yes, this is contingent funding. We can supplement you in country X with $100 million a year, that's substantial. That ought to get people's attention. I'm just playing here. And I think then they could really start talking about improving efficiencies. But I think us as a bunch of boffins in academics, I don't think it's really our business, because we don't have the gravitas to be able to do that. But absolutely, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there are a huge amount of efficiencies. I mean, the estimates that we've made are based on the status quo. In the Lindsay paper, their estimate for how much should come in was quite a bit less than mine, but it was only about half as much. And that was partly based on African parks. And I think, everybody can learn from other experience in getting those efficiencies improved. Absolutely.
For Rodrigo, I've got a question about CITES. To what extent do you think that all this trade that you're seeing through CITES contributes to the conservation of the animals that are involved?
There's a huge expanse of variety, of diversity there. There's trade that is completely a disaster, and there's trade that has significantly improved the situation of particular species. And my own assessment of the whole situation goes back and forth. I was a full supporter of South Africa's policy about elephants until they applied for a one-off sale to China for carving. They had so much stockpile of poached or culled elephants that they put them in a warehouse, and they were doing nothing with it. And then they applied for that. They were approved that one-off sale, And then when the results came out, there was one NGO called the Environmental Investigation Agency that did the DNA analysis of those elephants, and they found ivory from Zambia, from Angola, from Central African Republic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that effectively shut down the efforts of South Africa to continue that practice and have a second sale. At the same time, we still know today that between Botswana, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa, they have about 60% of the population of elephants in the world, African elephants in the world. So they're clearly doing something right. And all except for Botswana right now do have their own hunting programs there. So I am fully convinced that the potential is there. I am fully committed to continue helping the things that I believe are going to result in conservation to continue doing that. So there's everything from absolute disaster to the optimal result.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for a very rousing talk. With some horrific financial figures on what's needed and some very exciting examples of alternative approaches. But I wonder if you could clarify a bit further how you see the balance between state-protected areas, community-protected areas such as the conservancies that you showed, and landscape-based approaches such as the one that you showed in Asia, because it seems to me that the half-Earth approach is still geared very much towards just state-protected areas, whereas I think you were saying those other approaches are in some ways more promising. And I wonder if you could also say what implications that would have for funding streams and the amount of funding needed.
So I think that the thing about the protected area network as it exists has already done a lot of the things that I mean, they've certainly left scars with a lot of the local communities because people were forcibly removed, but that all happened. And so this is land that's already, by legislation and law, no people are allowed to live there. And so, to my mind, that's kind of like, that's your floor. And you want to look after the floor, you want to make sure that those are there. And I think that too many conservationists tend to take them for granted and assume that, oh, well, we'll just add to what's on the floor. And my point is, well, the floor is pretty creaky, and we got to really make sure that it's solid. And in terms of getting to all those landscape things, I think in almost every part of the world, those state-run places are going to be in there. They're in the mix somewhere. And you might be looking for corridors between them, or you might be looking out to dispersal areas from them, but I think they are the platform from which a lot of things can happen. And in terms of funding, I think that the kind of creativity that people can bring to these private areas, if you can really engage with the community that already thinks that elephants are super wonderful, fantastic, and you want to keep them, then you might be able to do it really at low costs. But if it's other areas where you've got tigers and they eat people, you've got to really make sure people are safe. And the expenses are going to vary depending on the location, the density of the people. I don't know of any simple algorithm that you could apply to estimate how much that's going to cost. It's likely to vary from place to place. But I think it's going to, and it could go from almost free and self-perpetuating to almost as expensive as the protected areas themselves, or even more, because there's many more people around. So I honestly don't know what the shortfall is there. But I guess all I'm trying to do is say, well, let's recognize that we've got these core areas. It's really, there's some legislative advantages because they're empty of people, and there are advantages for some species in some places like that. And as we go outward from there, we accommodate the people, and we don't put them at too much risk. And we also, all the kind of cost-benefit analysis people have been talking about in these different sessions.
Thanks very much. A question for Rodrigo. I'm really interested in your understanding or predictions of what happens to the dynamics when a country like Madagascar loses its CITES license or blessing. What happens to illegal trade? Is there a tipping point there?
Interesting question. This is the second time that Madagascar has been put in significant trade. The first time, this second time has to do with tropical timbers. The first time had to do with frogs. And I was part of that scenario that helped push Madagascar into significant trade. So Madagascar came like in 2007 with a huge harvest of frogs of the genus Mantella, which are beautiful, and they have 54 species endemic to each creek in Madagascar. They're all beautiful. Every frog collector wants one. So they were harvesting thousands and exporting thousands of each species. I came to see them together with some members of the European Union and some members of the US. And we said, do you have a management plan for these frogs? And they said, oh no, but it's coming. Okay, it's coming. That was a conference of parties. So the following year, Animals Committee, we go to them and we say, do you have the management plan? And they say, no, but it's coming. All right. Next Animals Committee is going to be the last Animals Committee before a COP. Last chance. All right. Next one, no management plan. So COP, we blow it open. And then Madagascar goes into significant trade, and we were not very popular in Madagascar, of course. And then the French government came to see Madagascar at their booth there, and they say, we have the money and the experts to do the management plans for the Mantella frogs. Right now, if you look at the website of CITES, they're only trading in 5 species of Mantella, and it's only a few hundred frogs of each of those species, and all of the others are completely off the market. So yes, it does work, and I'm pretty certain that it's going to be the same with rosewood that is putting them in significant trade. I mean, it's a huge source of income for the country, and they better behave. That's why I keep saying that. And this is just one example in which the entire country was put in significant trade. But there's many, many occasions in which a particular country is put with a particular species in significant trade, and they start working immediately.
This is a question for Craig. So, hello. You've given us 2 uses of protected areas that potentially contribute to their sustenance. So what about alternatives? For example, water sequestration, carbon sequestration, the REDD+ programs, things like that, that don't require protected areas in defensive terms, but require protected habitat types or protected ecosystems and contribute enormously both to planetary health and to community health. Are there more ways than just hunting and taking pictures that we can actually set aside land and ecosystems in a larger scale?
That's great. Yeah, I mean, if you could have REDD payments going to Amboseli, the park itself. They are. So,
the park itself, they're going to the communities outside.
Right, but what if the parks themselves are eligible for REDD payments? So, I mean, so that's something, I mean, I hadn't thought of that, and that's certainly something that somebody ought to bring up to whoever does this, that so the range states could go as a collective. It's kind of like OPEC with oil. They could be the carbon cartel and say, you know, every one of these countries who has parks, there could go into the REDD account. That'd be great. And then, yeah, REDD, well, of course. I mean, I didn't have a chance to go through everything that communities could be going for. But yeah, REDD credits are also a good one. I mean, and you know, it's something that, who was it on the first day was talking about, because you and I have talked about this, Dave, in the past, about not just carbon sequestration, but actually payments for biodiversity, if there was ever any kind of fund like that. And so if there was a biodiversity fund. A stewardship fund, yeah, that's great. That would be another idea, yeah. So a stewardship fund that could go to the communities as well as the REDD, and then the parks themselves should be eligible for both of those. And that could be another way of recognizing these at a large scale through supranational organizations. Yeah.
So, Bill and Mark Penty.
Okay. Question for Rodrigo. I can't remember which one of you said we used the B word and somebody else used the D word. I want to use the C word, which is China. And in talking about wildlife trade, you know, if you look about everything from ivory to rhino horn to pangolin scales to shark fin to many illegal timbers to tiger parts, and now, you know, new things like a huge increase in jaguar parts and pelts in Latin America as China increases there. I've heard of increases in lemur trade as China becomes more active in Madagascar. So that's kind of a 9,000-pound gorilla in the corner. And I guess my question is, from a CITES perspective, do you feel as though you're getting traction from China? And you know, are there strategies afoot to try to address that? Because I'm, you know, I guess as a consumer nation point of view, for many of these projects, China would be way out as number one as the consumer.
Talk
correct?
about a 100,000-pound elephant in the room. That's absolutely right. Let me tell you what is our take. In the previous conference of the parties in Johannesburg, part of my self-appointed mandate was to work with China and the United States in one document that would identify China and the United States as stakeholders in the incredible threat to the vaquita because of the trade of the totoaba, the fish, which a swim bladder can go for $37,000, one swim bladder this big, in the Chinese market in Hong Kong. But the totoaba, as the vaquita, are both endemic to the upper Gulf of California. And the vaquitas dying because of the gill nets that are put there to fish totoaba. And this is all in the organized crime situation in northern Mexico. But the swim bladder have to be exported to the United States and exported from San Diego or Los Angeles to China. And I wanted to have China name by name and the United States name by name. So we had a working group for 4 days during the last COP, in which I had China, the US, the EU, WWF, and several other observers who came to debate this. It took me 3 days. I had hair at the beginning of those meetings. I lost it all. It was like this, and the head of delegation of Mexico was my ambassador to South Africa, and he kept looking at me. I'm a pretty passionate guy, so he said, calm down, let them speak, let them leave, let steam out, and then we'll come back tomorrow with an additional proposal and so on and so forth. By the fourth day, they agreed, and the resolution is there in the website of CITES, in which China agrees that they are part of the problem. It took a long time, but now they do it. After the end of that, they invited me to a reception, gave me prizes and gifts and so on and so forth. I said, I don't want this to end here. What are we going to do? And this is one of my students. I teach every year in Spain. They bring the CITES authorities from Africa and Asia for 2 weeks in Spain, and I teach conservation biology and other things there. This is one of those guys that were sitting there in my classes, and he's now representing China. He said, I am already in contact with Beijing to have a workshop because we have a problem. When they are in the market, we cannot identify the totoaba swim bladder. So we need your experts to come to Mexico to help us identify those. That said, this is a first step on a million-step trip. We have a lot to work on. We are trying to get traction with the mako shark proposal. Mako shark is there, and we're listing it because of the fin soup. That's basically it. It's the second most sought-after species for fin soup. We don't have yet the point of entry, and the official position of China is reject the proposal. We have 58 states behind it, so we're going to have it passed, for sure. But China is not going to be in the equation. We are working, and it's a work in process, and it's going to be a work in progress for the foreseeable future. But I do see little glimpses of hope here and there.
Okay. All right.
Microphone across to Mark. Very good. And Mark, this will be the last question.
Okay, Craig, thank you. African parks. I've watched them with great interest from being a $6 million a year operation due to personal philanthropy, grown now up to $50 million a year due to largely foundation support. And they still write begging letters to one. I follow them on Instagram, and I think they do a wonderful job with neglected parks that would not get attention otherwise. But the price is high. Governments basically give up sovereignty to them. They give total management authority, permission to keep all revenues to replow back or whatever they want, and so government basically gives up for a period of 25 years. Now, in the scheme of things, that's only the midterm. Basically, is this a sustainable model? What happens at the end of 25 years? We know what can happen to good institutions very quickly with the reposting of a few key individuals. So what do you think?
I think that's the huge question about African parks. So there's what's known as the hold-up problem, which is that if you get a property that you're renting out or you're renting from someone and you turn it into something much more valuable, then you might get confiscated. And so they've tried to write in as many protections as they can against that. I think that in my discussions with them, they would be very happy if they could move away from private donors to like GEF funding. And I think if that, again, if what Edmund said the other day, if that anything like that ever really started, so if there really were these large multinational sources of institutional funding, there would have to be negotiations with African parks too about how they would take those on and what would be their exit strategy and all that sort of stuff. Right now, I think they're just mostly they've got a model and they're replicating it around the place. They've yet to get to the end of their contracts with any of these countries. They're close in Zambia. There is some resentment in Zambia because they've shown up the Zambian Wildlife Authority because their properties are doing much better than the government-run ones. So there's some resentment there. The Rwandan government wants them to take over all their parks, and they've said, no, we're not in the business of replacing your National Park Service. But it's a matter of time to find out, well, what are they in the business from? And is there going to be this kind of public-private partnership on a larger scale? Will there be a parallel to African parks? There's also individual philanthropists that are doing this on their own. Greg Carr, right now, he's been helping to do relief in Beira because of the big cyclone that hit Mozambique a few days ago. He puts in a huge amount of money from his own personal fortune. There are a few other billionaires that are doing that in Africa as well. So they're right now, it's kind of a trendy thing, and there are a number of people who are really dedicated to doing it, but is that going to be sustainable at all? Their children may not want to see that investment go forward. I think there has to be, again, this is new, and I think, again, that could be a good topic for the next or future workshops of this sort. How do the philanthropists go forward? How does this go on? Because there has to be a recognition of the rights and responsibilities of the host nation, that they can't just take away these properties from them and run them like an independent fiefdom. It should be representative of the nation as a whole. So I think these are really good questions, and these have to be addressed, and they just haven't got there yet. They haven't been around long enough.
Rodrigo, can I steal that? Let's applaud them both and thank them for sharing that.